Welcome back, everyone. This is Mo Al-Sumidai from the Clinical Trial Vanguard, and I am here at DPHARM with Paul McCracken, who is the founder and principal of RadiaNova Consulting. You guys specialize in insourcing imaging expertise in biopharma.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
A pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me today, Mo. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So my first question for you, Paul, is you've advised both large and early stage biotechs, and when it comes to clinical trial imaging systems, like what do you think is the most blind spot that you see in how sponsors think about imaging oversights in today's clinical trial environment?
No, I appreciate the question. I think the largest blind spot that we often see is a sponsor's underestimation of devi- uh, deviations from study protocols, imaging protocols, not only the deviation, but also the invisibility of that deviation, not being aware of its existence or not seeing it until later in the pipeline. We see trials where for some oncology trials that have been published using CT, could be 30% of the data was not right the first time. So you're having significant queries, and that it's not just a reader problem. This is actually a point of care problem with the data acquisition that can have a landslide effect later on downstream. There was one MR study that was published recently in a non-oncology study in which some 50% of the data was effectively unusable as it came off of systems.
And that's a very expensive outcome here because you basically throw out the entire study and have to redo it again.
It's that's an important part. So if you can catch the query in time, I think the challenge is patient management because patients might not have by the time you catch the query, if it's not until it's too late, bringing a patient back for reimaging could be costly if not impossible.
Yeah. And especially nowadays where imaging, every image costs so much more,
Absolutely,
it can really blow the budget out of the water.
absolutely. It's really important to avoid that rework.
So many sponsors still treat clinical trial imaging as like a downstream uh, data, not as a protocol critical behavior. What needs to change in how they design and execute clinical trials and their study operations?
No, we see that quite often, unfortunately, that imaging is seen as just a data collection, whereas oftentimes, particularly in oncology, but in other areas, it's a primary endpoint. It should be treated as such. That means it has to be considered in the protocol. That means it has to be considered in the charter. And that's not just considered. I mean, you need to identify specifications for the systems, equipments, timings, intervals for when things should be imaged, what should happen in the event, how it should be read. All of those details need to be designed into the trial very early on. I'll even say that oftentimes when sponsors contract with clinical CROs, the imaging CRO or the imaging component is an afterthought. They make a site selections, they make CRO selections. Then months after that, they're like, okay, now let's pick an imaging CRO. If they're not considering the imaging CRO until that far down, it's unlikely that the imaging data collection or site selection has been built into by design.
Mhm. So, Paul, you've worked on cutting edge radioligand and theranostic programs. How are these trials reshaping what imaging teams are accountable for operationally?
Uh, Mo, that's a great question. We've seen over the past few years, in particular, some 90 or so companies have sprouted up in the theranostic and radiopharmaceutical therapy. We've seen multi-billion-dollar acquisitions of large pharma into that space, huge infrastructure investments globally to provide that care. What you're finding is that imaging is no longer an endpoint, but actually a backbone to the clinical trial. And by that, I mean we're much more operationally involved when it's a radio pharmaceutical radioligand therapy. You're helping oftentimes in patient selection now. There could even be some site safety questions related to the handling of the radioisotope. And then importantly, and I commented on this on LinkedIn, but there's recent draft guidance for radiopharmaceutical development that has an important component around dosimetry. So the imaging plays a central role towards the assessment of dosimetry as well. And that's an outsized impact that imaging is having. So it's no longer just we're collecting data at the end of a trial or somewhere along the way. Now, particularly for the radioligand therapy theranostics, imaging is driving the operational backbone of that particularly early phase trials.
Mhm. So, Paul, you've spent your career improving imaging workflows at scale. I understand you worked at Merck and at Icon as well. Where do you see the biggest gaps today in how trial teams manage imaging, data traceability, and version control?
Now, that's a great question. We're seeing, certainly, and have seen, particularly in light of a recent regulatory environment, provenance is really the Achilles heel when it comes to imaging trials. Being able to know the who, what, when, and where of the data is very important. So we're talking about when were things imaged, who was selecting lesions, if things, particularly if they go to adjudication or they're reread, or there's an error that's reread, too often there are examples that have been published and spoken to, particularly from a regulatory perspective, of audit trails that were incomplete for data throughout that. So being able to have immutable data, an immutable audit trail throughout the entire process, regardless of deviations and how those have been addressed, is essential and clearly outlined by the regulatory agencies.
Mhm. And how has the push towards AI driven read platforms and image QC changed what you look for in partner imaging systems? Or what would you advise clients to demand from these vendors?
These are really important points, particularly with the push for AI, machine learning that we're seeing in the space. You can't go to a conference in our space without half of the tables leading with their AI capabilities. But from a practical perspective, you really need to consider, I call it a gray box instead of a black box. You can't just have answers arrive and assume that that's the truth. You need the ability to interrogate the system to understand how certain decisions were made. Also, too often we see really sort of sophisticated and exciting tools being presented with great areas under the curve showing how well they work. But that's in a very specific instance. You need to hold those vendors accountable for how will that work on our data very specifically. You need the ability to interrogate it, you need to understand how those decisions were arrived to, and you need to really look at that entire process in a very transparent way.
And you have to link the dots essentially. I mean, one of the things that, going back to the regulatory piece is that R3 is now coming out
Yes,
with very specific recommendations to digitize all of your
absolutely.
operations and also demonstrate oversight.
Absolutely.
So, like, when it comes to the imaging as a whole, how do these technology systems fit into R3 from an oversight standpoint, from a governance standpoint?
You have to have that traceability. You have to have that audit trail capability. You need to know where the ones and zeros are from the point at which they're acquired to the site to the point at which they're delivered to an agency. And we've all seen it. They go to the sites, they go to the CRO, they go to the imaging CRO. They look for that consistency of data throughout that process, which can be complicated if you have multiple adjudications, multiple readers, multiple sites, global organization. So you need to be able to have that transparency. I think is really key. Transparency and traceability.
Absolutely. You have to, when I was a CRA, they say you have to link the dots. And that's one way of doing that, especially with imaging. And right now, from what I understand, a lot of it is just emails and PDFs, basically.
There are still those that live in the email and PDF world, unfortunately,
Yeah.
taking signatures, notifications to sites going basically as a site limitation in a very paper and pencil kind of way. And I don't think anyone's doing anything dishonestly. I don't think anyone's not being in earnest. But I think that systems need to keep up with the expectations, particularly in a digital world.
Right. And it's a risk not taking on technologies
It
like
is a
this.
risk, and yet the agency has held people accountable for not being able to show that provenance
Right.
throughout the process.
And if you had a chance to choose a single metric that best signals whether an imaging system is delivering clinical value, not just functioning, what would that be?
I mean, I recommend to my partners, to my clients, there's a set of something like 30 metrics that you could look at. Some of the MCC metrics and others that have been developed over lots of experience throughout time that really speak to site performance, CRO performance, sponsor performance, imaging CRO performance, reader performance. I mean, there's a whole basket of metrics that you can look. But if you're looking for one, it's probably first pass on time readiness, and that's an amalgamation of a number of things. But that effectively means you've got query-free data, read-ready within 48 to 72 hours, and you want to target something like 85 to 90% of that data should be passing that metric in order for that to succeed. And that has lots of implications on site performance, on your QC process, on your imaging specialists that are reviewing data, because that data, that metric will roll up from a lot of those different pieces.
Thank you so much, Paul. Paul
Thank you,
McCracken,
Mo.
everyone,
Appreciate it.
founder and principal of RadiaNova Consulting. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me today, Mo. Appreciate it very much.